Let's come back to interfaces for objects. You can also define optional properties in interfaces and also in classes, as I will show you. For that, you add your property name. Let's say output name here. Can be whatever you want, of course, and that should be a string, but I don't want to force every class based on name to have that. It should be optional whether you want to have that or not. You can specify an optional property by adding a question mark after the property name. This tells TypeScript that this property might exist in classes that implement this interface, but it doesn't have to. And therefore we get no error here in person, even though I don't have an output name property, because it is optional. Now, of course, I can add output name here and initialize this with some value or use it like any other property, but I don't have to. Now, on a class, you can also have an optional property. Let's say name here should be optional, because maybe we don't get a value here for n. We can add a question mark here as well in our class. We now just also have to make it optional here in named. Otherwise, we violate against our interface, which forces this to be a string. Now I'm saying this can be optional. So here it's now optional. And here, when I set this equal to n, I only want to do this if n is truthy, if it is set. So only if it's not an empty string, for example. Otherwise, name will not be set, and that is okay because I turned it to be an optional property both here in the interface but also in my class. So now here, when we construct a new object, we could do this without passing in a name. To allow that, we have to go to the constructor and provide a default value here, or also add a question mark here. This is also allowed. You can add optional parameters either by providing a default fallback value or by adding a question mark, in which case the default value will be undefined. And now we can call this constructor without a value because we have that optional parameter, and because we have the optional property, that is okay. We don't need to initialize it. And hence thereafter, if we greet, well, this name, of course, will yield undefined. So probably we should check here as well if we got a name, and if we do, we console log this, else we console log hi without any reference to the name because we don't have one. If we save that, everything compiles and we see just hi here because I didn't provide a name. So that would be optional properties, both in a class and in an interface, and also in my constructor list here. And now just to make it really clear again, these three things are only loosely related. You can have an optional property in an interface and then implement it as a non-optional property in the class. You then just have to make sure that your logic is such that this is always initialized, otherwise you get an error, as you just saw. Or you have an optional property in an interface and an optional property in your class. Then you don't have to assign a value in all cases here. And in addition, and also totally unrelated here, you can have optional parameters in functions and therefore also in methods, including the constructor method. Optional parameters are defined either with the question mark, where the default value, if not set, is therefore undefined, or simply by assigning a default value like this. Then, as you learned, this is also optional, and the default value will be assumed if you don't pass in a more specific value. So this gives you more flexibility in how you structure your classes, and when we talk about interfaces, how you structure your contracts classes might need to adhere to.